How many of you were not here last week? Okay, what I'm going to do is give you just a little bit of a recap. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but a recap of how we get to tonight. We are in a series. This is the second night, and the series, I've got a new book out called 9 Things You Simply Must Do to Succeed in Love and Life. And what we're doing is we're going to go through all 9. And last week, I did kind of the introduction of where they came from, and the first of the 9. And tonight, I'm going to do the second and third. Okay, and then we're going to continue. But I want to just say a little bit in recap for those of you who weren't here about kind of where this stuff comes from and what the 9 things are. And the very short version of that, you can get the taped here, the long version, but the short version is, when I went into practice many years ago, happenstance and providence, and for no reason that I planned, I ended up originally going into practice in a practice that worked in a lot of organizational consulting. And so they worked with a lot of people in high levels of leadership in organizations and corporations and things like that. And so I kind of started out working with people in leadership from the clinical side of things. Like I was working on personal growth issues, but it just so happened to be with kind of high performer type people. And over the years, what I did was I continued to do a lot of leadership consulting and still do. And it just gave me a sort of an interesting chair to sit in for many, many years of watching people who tend to succeed in pursuing their work life, and then through a lot of that also seeing a lot of people who succeed in their relational life. And what happened was, over the years, you know, when you kind of watch a lot of people who do well, some of it begins to emerge as to how they do that. And so I went on a little study about starting, I don't know, and I'm always guessing, but it's like in the last somewhere between 5 and 10 years of specifically, I was going to watch people who do well in love and life, and instead of just look at the problem scenarios, look at people who are succeeding. And what I mean by success is that basically life is working for them, that they are kind of finding what God made them to do and who God made them to be, and they are pursuing relationships and working out of their goals and talents and stuff like that, and that it's going well. And so that's kind of where this came from, and I came up with or observed 9 things that people who do well tend to all do in common. Okay? So that's where we are, and last week was the first one, and that was one called Dig It Up. And tonight we're going to do 2 more, and the first one I'll be doing, number 2, is Pull the Tooth. We've got some dentists here tonight, and you line up and they'll pull your tooth. And then the next one is called Play the Movie. Okay? So that's where we're headed. So the first one, if you look on your outline, Pull the Tooth, what does that mean? Well, let me ask you a question. How many of you tonight, just right now, if you were honest, please be honest. How many of you would admit that either right now or at some prolonged period of time in your life that you have or do now basically chew on one side of your mouth because the other one is a little too sensitive? Okay, now hands up high. Okay, we can have a support group here. All right? Now, I've done that too. Why do you do that? There are dentists in the world. I mean, that can be fixed. Okay? Now, I don't know why you do that, but it has something to do with, other than the fact, for most of you, I mean, somebody may have something unsolvable, but somehow you have gotten trained for whatever reason to put up with pain. Okay? To put up with pain, or to put up with discomfort, or somehow think other things are more urgent, or other people are more urgent, or whatever it is, other than fixing this. Now, that's just a metaphor, but there's 8 million of these kinds of things, and that's how I came up with the term pull the tooth. And let me tell you what pull the tooth means. I'm going to start out with kind of the principle. People who do very well in their business-oriented, career-oriented, pursuing goals-oriented life, the life of getting things done and achieving things. And people who do well in relationships pull the tooth, as opposed to allow it to sit there and bother them, not doing anything about it for some extended period of time. In other words, here's the principle. People who succeed deal with negative energy drains quickly, not slowly. Okay? This is just something that they do. They don't allow negative energy drains of whatever kind, physical, emotional, psychological, relational, financial, whatever those are. As soon as it comes up on the radar screen, something is bugging me, or something is wrong, or something's not working, they move and they act quickly to do something about it. That's the principle. What we're going to do in this first section is we're going to go through a lot of nuances of that and kind of show some of the different contexts and the ways that this can happen. Okay? So point number 1 says the brain drain. The brain drain. And here's kind of what that means. When you have pain, and pain may be acute, severe pain, or pain may be a nagging, sort of chronic pain. Pain may be debilitating. Pain may not be debilitating, but just interferes with your functioning. Or pain may be just, as we're going to see, not something that's so much hurting you as much as you're realizing the gap between what's going on and what is versus what you want or what ought to be. Okay, it can be all over the map, as we'll see. But the point is that God has designed you in a way that negative experience or negative evaluation is supposed to be a signal, not a state. Okay, now I'm going to say that again. God made you to ache. He made you to hurt. In fact, some of the most severe illnesses and dangerous illnesses that there are when people neurologically lose the ability to know that they're in pain. They lose the ability to know that something is wrong. I mean, you can have a limb fall off or get infected if you don't know that anything's wrong. Okay? So this is a big deal. Hebrews, for example, chapter 5, says that solid food is for the mature who through practice, get this, through practice have had their senses trained to discern good from evil. Had their senses trained. In other words, they go through life and their senses are heightened and they get a quick feeling when something's wrong or something's not right or something's not good. And they discern quickly, oh, something's wrong over here, and then they do something about it. So God has actually wired us to know when there's a gap between the way things ought to be and the way that they are, but He's wired us in that way so that we can do something about it, not so we can stay in misery. You know, if you look at how God operates when something's wrong, He doesn't just sit there and do nothing about it. He starts to act. Now, here's the question. Why do we get trained out of our senses? You know, if you look at little kids, they're not like this. If something's bothering them, it's real quick. You know, they'll let you know if they're babies or, you know, if they're toddlers or if they get older, especially if they're teenagers, and you're happy to say, fine, you know, go somewhere else. But the point is that when something is wrong, it's natural to know that the brain is draining, and it's natural to use that knowledge to do something about it. What we find is people that do well act on that. Okay? Now, let's go to the next point, because this is kind of sort of the first place it starts. And what I find is it's interesting. It says level 1, but it's interesting to me, even though I called it level 1 in the book, and level 2 is the next one, which will make more sense after I say it. But level 1, as you're going to see, is not necessarily about a toothache. In other words, it's not necessarily that something is wrong, but what I've noticed in successful people is they are just as quick to do level 1 as they are level 2. Now let me give you an example of what I mean by that. Here's a story I put in the book of level 1, but I've seen 8,000 different examples of this. I know a man who owns a company that he basically started. What he did was he bought a company, and at the time, the company had revenues of virtually or basically something in the 20 million a year range. Okay, and he bought that company, and it had profits. Okay. In about, I don't know exactly the number, but I'm going to guess, somewhere short of 10 years, he had built it to somewhere between a $400 and $500 million company. Now that's a lot of growth, and that's a good success story. And I was talking to him one day, and I asked him, how did you do this? How did you take something that size and get it to something this size? And he said, well, the first thing I did was I gave away 80%, basically. And what I mean by gave away is he said, I just got rid of it and sold 80% of what existed that I had bought at pennies on the dollar. I just, at huge losses. I just wanted to get rid of it, and I kept 20% of what I'd bought. I said, okay, I took math. Let me see. I've got $1. I give away 80 cents. Now I have 20 cents. Boy, I'm on my way now, right? It's counterintuitive. It makes no sense. I said, well, why did you do that? And here's the point, and this is the principle that I want you to get, because it's true in every endeavor of life. Here's what he said. He said, the company was profitable. The 100% of it was profitable. Everything was doing, everything was making money. He said, but as I looked at it all, the life of the company was in about 20% of it. In other words, the real potential and the real what it could do was in about 20%. And as I saw it, he said the 80% that was doing okay, even though it was profitable, was a distraction from what we ought to be doing. So I wanted it out of there. Even though it was profitable, even though it was good, he said, I wanted it out of our plate. I didn't want to spend time on it. I didn't want to spend resources on it. I didn't want to spend the people on it, because the real life was in the 20%. He did that quickly. He did it decisively. But the point is, he was able to do it because he had this orientation that it was a brain drain. And what for him, as we see, with other people who do well, is that it was negative because it was taking away energy and resources from what he ought to be doing. Now that's a business example of that, and we see that all the time. But there are the way that people spend their time and energy examples of that. There are, ways in which people allow their community, their sense of community and relationships and all of that stuff to work that way. In other words, there may be, some ways that they're spending time and even, some friendships and some relationships that for whatever reason are not where, for a lot of different reasons, where they should be investing and pouring their time. But for who knows why, they're spread out all over the place and not going deep anywhere. Now, I'm not saying, go jettison all the people in your life. But what I am saying is that probably, in all seasons or various seasons, I'm going to spill this if I don't watch it, various seasons of life, in all the areas, we spend time and we spend money and we spend effort and we spend resources and all sorts of things like that in places where not much good is coming from it. And what happens with people who build depth is they begin to see where they want to pour their resources, where they want to pour their time, where they want to pour their energy, where they want to pour their love, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? So that's level one. Level one of this principle is when you do an inventory of your life and you evaluate how you're going to focus, not necessarily on just is something good or not, but is something the best or not. And sometimes you can be spending a lot of time. I mean, there's a lot of things you can do with your time. But what we see is people begin to look at their time as a valuable commodity because actually your time kind of equals your life in a certain kind of way. So that's level one. Level two, what I call the big leagues, that's actually where there's something bad going on. Okay? Now, what we see about people who do well is that when something, see, the first thing, there was nothing bad. There's nothing wrong, with departments and operations in a company that are profitable. That's good. A lot of companies want to be profitable. But what was bad about it was that it wasn't the best. In this second instance, though, of the big leagues, that's where there is something that is really negative. Now, here's the point. People who do well in relationships and in the rest of life, they don't, just because there's a negative thing in a relationship, they don't get rid of the person. In fact, they tend to be, in a certain way, slower to get rid of relationships than some other people who don't work on them. But because they have deep commitments, what they do is they don't get rid of the person or the relationship to get rid of the brain drain, but they address the brain drain quickly. Very quickly, and they go to work on the problem. Okay? Let me say that again. They address the brain drain quickly, and they go to work on the problem. Now, here's kind of an example of the difference. We wrote a book called Boundaries. And it's really interesting to see some people who say, I've been long-suffering. You know how the Bible talks about long-suffering. And they say, I've put up with this forever, and I've put up with this for so long, and now I'm going to have some boundaries. I'm not going to put up with this anymore, and they just kind of get rid of the person. And when you begin to sort of look at it, what's been true is you can't really call that long-suffering. You can call it long brain damage, or, I've been a victim, or I've been unaware, or I've been too passive, or whatever it is. But what long-suffering is when we actually begin to suffer well. And what we see about people who do, relationships well is they don't do the bad kind of suffering very long at all. In other words, what I mean by that is getting abused or getting mistreated or getting ignored or getting whatever without addressing it. Like they got this big cavity in their tooth and they just kind of like tiptoe around it and kind of put up with a lot of negative stuff without addressing it until one day, I can't take it anymore, and they kind of bail out. That's not what they do. Long suffering, though, is when they know that something's wrong in a relationship, but they move quickly. They move really quickly to address it. And once you start to address it and you're confronting it and you're dealing with it, and you're trying to be a healing agent, and you're trying to be redemptive and all that sort of stuff, then they have great patience with the person. And the reason they can have great patience is because they're proactively dealing with the problem towards some objective end. Okay? See the difference in that? And what I want you to ask yourself is, are there situations going on where there really is something bad and it's not being addressed? Because what we know is that's not going to get you further down the road. Now, what will get you further down the road is addressing that proactively, and that's kind of when the meter starts ticking. That's when long-suffering begins. And that's when patience begins. That's when forbearance and all that sort of stuff begins as well. Okay? The next one. This is just a point that I want you to sort of see. It says success depends on two factors. Success depends on two factors. The first one is what I've talked about. Someone's ability to confront a problem quickly and decisively, and resolve it. Okay? Quickly, decisively, and resolve it. Now, resolution doesn't always come quickly, but they act quickly. And they're on some sort of move towards resolving it. I think I told y'all the story not too long ago about the guy I was playing golf with at a men's golf retreat, which is another, it's just kind of a trick that churches do to get men to be spiritual for a couple of days. And I'm walking down the fairway with this guy, and on the first hole, and he knows I write books about relationships, and so he says, that he hopes he and his girlfriend are going to get married. And I said, well, that's really cool. Is she nice? And he says, yeah. I said, do you like her? And he says, oh, yeah, I really like her. And I said, well, why don't you do it? And he said, well, she's really controlling. And I said, well, how, what do you mean? How is she controlling? And he started to name some ways, and I said, that's not controlling. That's like psychotic. It was bad. She was really, I don't know how he dealt with that. So I figured this couldn't be going on too long. And he's continuing to talk, and he said, but I really hope that she's the one. And I'm really trusting that God's going to make this thing happen, and he's going to bring it around because I really love her, and she's wonderful. And I go, but she's really controlling. He says, yeah, that, I know that. And it's sort of like this one little speed bump in this otherwise, beautiful picture. And so I got curious about how long he would sort of wait. And I said, how long have you been dating her? 8 years. 8 years. Pull the tooth. I just don't know a really happy, fulfilled, successful person that would do that for 8 years. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not talking about like bailing out of a marriage or something like that, but this is a guy talking about dating somebody, which by definition is, sort of a shopping spree anyway. He's I don't mean that bad, but it's not like he's signed up for it, right? When you date, you're trying to find out if this is, the particular brand of brain damage you want for a long time. And what is going on? 8 years hoping and just waiting. You just can't find people who do well that do that. I defy you. Find people who do well that do that. And that's my point about this point. That people who do well deal quickly to resolve things. Now, I wouldn't mind him putting in a year or two more, not because he's invested 8. Now, that's a dumb idea. And you hear some people doing that, well, we got 8 years in this, we ought to make it work. Well, just because you bang your head up against the wall for 8 years, you owe it 2 more? I don't think so. But if there were some sort of plan and he moved, and this was the first point, they move quickly, but they move quickly to resolve it. They get involved in the process of making it better. That's when long-suffering starts. And that's when you can actually call it hope instead of wishing, as you've probably heard me say before. If you don't have objective reasons to hope for something, all you're doing is wishing. I hope this works out. I hope this relationship works out. I hope God makes it work. Well, what objective reasons do you have to place your hope in? Because when the Bible talks about hope, it talks about objective, specific reasons that something's going to happen. That God's involved, that the person is seeing the light, or forces are being brought to the person to have them see the light, that wisdom is being gained, that character change is being worked on, that they're learning principles. There's a lot of ways in which the Bible says, if these things are in place, even though it hasn't happened yet, you can hope. But I didn't see anything. His greatest hope was that this golf retreat would get her out of his hair for, a couple of days. That was a joke, but it was true. Okay? He just had no hope. So they moved quickly, not to just throw things away, but they move quickly to get involved in a process that would resolve something. Okay, that's the first factor. I heard it said in a seminar one time, a business seminar, that people's ability to succeed, or a different way, let me put it this way, somebody's level of success in life will always be equal to their ability to confront. Someone's level of success in life will always be equal to their ability to confront. And when you think about it, how could it be any other way? Because what you're talking about is if this is the goal that you want to get to and you're starting here, there are not just angels drifting in this space right here, grabbing your hand saying, come on up to the lottery town. That's not how life works. In between where we are and whatever our goal is, there's obstacles, problems, lions and tigers and bears. And especially with names. Those problems usually have a face. And they're people. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. That's what life is about, is solving problems and being a redemptive agent in our relationships. But the point is, you're going to run into problems, and those problems are going to have names and faces. And if we can't confront, as soon as one of those problems occurs, well, that's where we're going to get to. But people who succeed see life as confronting one issue after another, and they don't see that as a negative thing. They see that as kind of a synonym for life. Confront means to turn your face towards. So they do it quickly. But the second factor involved in success is not just that they move quickly to confront something and resolve it, but the second factor, because a lot of people do that, but the second factor is when it is not resolvable, they can let it go. When it's not resolvable, they can let it go. Ecclesiastes says there's a time, and it gives all these different times. And part of it is there's a time to seek and a time to give up is lost. You know, the Bible says that God is patient and He's long-suffering. And He says, you know, He's given us, and He gives people, He gives humanity a long time to get it. But long doesn't mean infinite. Long is long, but long's not forever. And one day, it says He's going to shut the door. That's always a tough call. I shouldn't say always. Often it's a tough call. But let me give you kind of a guiding sort of principle or two about that. How long do you go with something before you shut it down? Now, in my view, there are some things that you are, that you don't just, bail out of, like marriage, for example. But the Bible even talks about, some instances where that could be shut down. But in general, in things that are not designed to end, God has designed a lot of things that are not designed to end, and I think our commitment calls to mirror His commitment to us. But there are a lot of things that the Bible talks about, realities of where the season for that is over, or the season for something to be alive is over. And it gives some pretty helpful criteria. One of them is after you have done everything possible yourself to fix it, number one. Number two, when what I'm doing to fix it doesn't work, I've done everything that I can do to bring in other people to help fix it. Because maybe it's fixable, but I don't have the abilities. In relationships, that would be to bring in, like Matthew 18 says, a couple of other people to help the person get it and get through their thick skull, what we've been trying to say. It's really interesting. You, as a marriage counselor, you see couples who've been arguing about something, and they come in, and you're embroiled in all this stuff, and then, the counselor turns to one of them and says, well, I think you're a little, sort of, critical or something about this. And the person goes, really? Gosh, do I sound that way? And the other spouse is going, like, I've been saying that for 5 years, but why come when the counselor says it, you'll hear it? Now we got a new thing to fight on, right? But sometimes it's bringing somebody else in or other resources in. You see this in business all the time. People, they're not going to make it, but they bring in outside consultants. They bring in outside financing. They bring in all sorts of other stuff, or they do a merger, or. The point is that one of the things the Bible talks about is you're being active first, but secondly, when you can't do it, that doesn't mean it's lost. It means that you might need more. So ask yourself, have I brought more to the table? Number 3, have I brought more wisdom and learned things and brought more information to this scenario than I had? Number 4, is the other side getting and using everything that I'm bringing? And then if they're not, sometimes have I begun to bring some consequences to turn up more heat to get change? And then sometimes things are just not resolvable. Paul says, for example, inasmuch as it depends on you, be at peace with all men. Understanding that it does, to some degree, depend on the other person too. It takes 2 to tango. Okay? So, 2 factors. Can you confront quickly and decisively to work towards resolving a problem? And number 2, if the tooth is not fixable, can you pull it? Some people can't. It's hard for them. And that's a problem. And that's when it's time to begin to see what is it about a natural life cycle that has gone awry in our souls. In other words, it is a natural thing to be able to go through the death of something. And sometimes that's a dream, giving up on a dream. It's going to die. I mean, sometimes we just have to face it. I've shared, my own with you. I grew up a competitive golfer, and my dream in life from the time I was really little until college, I wanted to play golf. And had some successes and stuff, and wanted to try it, and was recruited to a top 10 college to do that. And I had a crazy sort of tendon injury in my left hand, and I got to where I could barely hold on to the club, and I went to a doctor, and I went to another doctor, and I went to another doctor, and went to another doctor, and they couldn't fix it. And then they tried this, and then they tried that. Well, 1, 2, 3, 4, probably 5 states and 14 doctors later, I got the message. And that was a really hard thing to do, to let that path of so many years die. I was probably a little slow on the uptake. Okay? But at the same time, I could have stayed in denial longer and continued to, kind of flail away at it. And some people, do it even longer than that. And you see some people, they just ought to let it go. I live in LA, and I meet a lot of actors. I ask them could you bring me some more water and some bread, or, because there are a lot of them. You talk to a lot of these waiters, and some of them will be the next George Clooney. There are a lot of them that ought to go back to Minnesota. They've given it a shot, and they ought to go back. Now, here's the thing. You talk to most really successful people, and they will tell you the 5 things that they had to give up. Because that's part of life, is pouring yourself into things to find out more of who you are and what you're supposed to be doing, but you never will get the real one if you can't let go to the ones that aren't real. You see that in dating all the time. I mean, what magic bullet was going to hit this guy in year 9? How many of you are single? Okay? Not all of you, but some of you are dating someone, and the 2 of you need to look each other in the eye and just wave the white flag. Right? Now, some of you need to look each other in the eye and say, now, why aren't we going the next step? Okay, probably because the woman has commitment phobia, but that's another night. Sometimes it's time to let it go. I can't tell you when that is, but you have to figure it out. Okay, and then the next one, here's a problem. Here's a problem. Oh, shoot. I meant to bring a book up here. Does anybody happen to have this book with you? Anybody have it? Oh, thank you. You know, when you spend like a long time and a lot of brain damage writing a book, it's nice to know that one person buys it. All right. Here's the problem. The brain drains at the wrong time in people who don't practice pull the tooth. The brain drains at the wrong time. Let me give you just a few examples of this. What this means is your tooth hurts at the precise time that there's no dentist within 50 miles and it's the middle of the night, and that's when the abscess happens. Right? Of course, it's only been there for 3 years. But when does the brain really get it? In non-successful people, the brain gets it at the very time you can't do anything about it. Successful people act upon it when they can do something about it before it gets to a point to where something happens when they can't do anything about it. Now, let me give you just a few examples of this. Just a few. There's a million of them in here. The drinking problem of a spouse that's not being addressed effectively seems to get the most attention at the family gathering when the person's had too much to drink. Not the best time to fix this. Number 2, the problem with the boyfriend who's not committing enough to the relationship tends to get addressed in the phone call when he lets you down for the 100th weekend. That's not really the time that's going to work. It needs to be a little more structured than that. The third one, the character issues of a 19-year-old son that have bugged you for years are not faced until he flunks out of college or gets sent home for drug abuse. The tax issue you've avoided pops into your mind the moment you lay your head down on your pillow to sleep or when you wake up in the middle of the night. The debt or interest rates not being faced, or the budget that's not being prepared, or the creditors that are not being dealt with, worry you worst when you have to make a crucial financial decision or purchase. Because that's the time of the crisis. It should be taken care of before then. An acquaintance with people who hurt you consistently is all the more painful as you spend a rare night out. You don't get those nights out often. You spend a rare night out with these people and you feel like, why did I do this again? The tire needs fixing is on your mind during a drive to an important appointment. Right? You mentally are kicking yourself because you've been putting this off. And you know it could go right then. An unresolved conflict with a friend or loved one hits you hard when you are away from them, causing crummy feelings that you carry around but do nothing about. Okay, we could continue to go on. But the point is, these, can I keep, this is a good book. I'm going to hang on to this. Okay. Now, I may need it to refer to. Okay, the point is, people who pull the tooth, those aren't the times they think about these things. They think about things with the Rolodex there, or the Palm Pilot, where they can, call the tire company or call the drug counselor or call the boyfriend to set up a lunch to confront this, et cetera, et cetera. Their brain and their action comes together at times that something can be done about this. That's the point. When to let go, I mentioned that, but I wanted to put it in your outline as well. When there are objective reasons, like I mentioned, that have all been tried for whatever time the particular scenario dictates. Okay? If you've got a lot invested in a business, for example, then, or, a relationship or whatever, and there's reasons to spend, sometimes there's a lot of time that's invested in trying to make it work. It can be years. But, if you plan to go to the movies one night and you can't find one that's open and you drive to 3 or 4 and you're using up all your time, you don't invest the rest of the night. How long do you invest? It depends. It depends on what's at stake. It depends on how important it is. And then the cringe factor. The cringe factor is this. The best way to avoid a problem, the best way to fix a problem always, is to not have it. The best way to fix a problem is to not have it to begin with. A number of years ago, I was at kind of one of those transition times, and I was looking at a lot of different options of what, to do next. And I called somebody who lives in another state, who's a wise guy and knows me and knows what I do and stuff. And I asked him if he just kind of listen to the options and tell me what he thought. And so I flew up there, and we spent a couple of days just sort of, hashing this out. And I told him about the different scenarios, and one of them was looking pretty interesting. And the only problem was it involved working with a certain person that he and I both knew. And he said, well, you know him. I said, yeah. He said, well, how do you feel about that? I said, well, that's kind of a problem. I liked the project, but I would be working with him, who this guy was. And he goes, let me tell you something. He said, at the time, I think he said I'm 45 years old. And he said, at this point in my life, I don't do anything that involves the cringe factor. I said, what's the cringe factor? He said, the cringe factor is those times where you're about to go forward in anything and you have to cringe or take a big gulp to do it. Like, I got to work with this guy. Everything, but you cringe at the thought of it, but you go for it. He said, I just don't do it anymore. Life's too short, and I've had too many train wrecks when I went past the point when there was a cringe factor. And then the last one is something I've already said. This does not neglect long suffering and the like. We're not talking about bailing out of things just because they're negative. What we're talking about is ending the toxic negativity that not addressing them has to do with until they are fixable. Okay? So, pull the tooth. How many of you tomorrow are going to call the dentist that said you're only chewing on one side of your mouth? Okay? You're not? You're going to keep doing that? Okay, we're going to pray for you. At least one man has seen the light. Okay.